Thank you for having me here. Thank you, Meenakshi. I'm really happy to be here. So, as Meenakshi mentioned, I'm here representing Deter Lab. Deter is it's a cybersecurity testing infrastructure, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we're trying to improve cybersecurity experimentation. So, our goal is really to create a collaborative cybersecurity infrastructure where we can all benefit through collaboration. Primarily, basically, the idea is how we can capture expertise from cybersecurity experimentation, provide effective tools so you can apply this expertise so that we can have a better understanding of what's happening out there. I'll tell you a little bit about our team. We have PI John Ruklowski, Steve Schwab, Terry Benzel. We've been maintaining this test bed, which actually spans the Information Science Institute and UC Berkeley. We have about 400 nodes there. It's been up and running since about 2003. It's been supported by the Department of Homeland Security, for some time by the National Science Foundation. We have a large team, about 13 plus of us, and I'm primarily leading the groups to do experiment lifecycle management, design and analyses, which I'll be talking about. So the experimentation process, fundamentally what we're trying to do with the experimentation process is study the behavior of systems, study the behavior of cybersecurity systems, understand really how these systems work, understand the underlying structure, understand how their structure relates to their behavior so that we get a better understanding of our world out there. And computer science is fundamentally an empirical science where we try to measure and analyze what we're trying to do. And so there are essentially three phases within these experiments. You have a definition phase where you define what your experiment is, you evaluate it within the test bed, and you analyze it. Now this process is actually could be applied to even observations from the internet, where you actually define a hypothesis, you evaluate your hypothesis, and then you analyze your data. This is highly iterative. You constantly refining this process, and so this is what we're going to talk about really here today. Let me sort of give you an example of what I mean. This is from a personal experience of an experiment which we've done in the past. This is really a simplified view of what an experiment would look like on the test bed. You have a bunch of attackers on the internet, and what you really want to do is evaluate an intrusion detection system. And so you sort of deploy this on the test bed, and you have an attack begin, attacker sends some traffic trying to compromise a target, and the intrusion detection system tries to really communicate, identify what's going on, try to detect this attack. Once they detect the attack, they try to eliminate it by installing firewalls. So this is what would be, a large experiment which would go on the test bed. Fundamentally, what we realize is that there are three dimensions where you try to push when you're doing an experiment. You're trying to understand how, as you increase the level of detail within your experiment, how it changes. And what I mean by detail is as you add the models which you use for your attacker. Your attacker could be a simple constant bitrate source attacker. Could it taking code from the real internet? What are your models for these things? What are your models for cross traffic to create a realistic environment? What is your scale? How do you increase the number of the subnets you're considering? What about the scale of how many attackers are there within your test bed? How long do you run your experiment? And the third dimension you usually try to push is complexity, with the multi-protocol analysis. How many background, what's the complexity of your background traffic? What's the complexity of the communication protocol between your intrusion detection system? And what you're essentially doing when you do any experimentation process is you're trying to push against these three dimensions to create as realistic of an environment so that you're doing an effective evaluation of your intrusion detection system or any mechanism. And what's happening really is several iterations are really required to grow your experiment to a large scale, and each iteration requires careful design and analysis because you're generating data from large number of sources. You have multiple moving components as you're trying to scale up and create a realistic environment. And currently, these processes are very hard and brittle. And so experimentation is increasingly very hard to do. We, in fact, see very, large-scale experiments are more rare than they should really be. And what we really believe is that what's happening is that it's just having these resources is not enough. It's not just enough having test beds available. It's not just enough having nodes and routers and topology libraries and traffic generators and monitors. But if you make all these available, which we have for the last couple of years, it's not enough because people really don't know how to put them together correctly. How do you actually use these correctly? And the emphasis really here is in correctly using it, because it's very easy to construct wrong experiments. You could really take these pieces together, and if you're really not very careful, experiments go wrong very easily. And this is a very difficult problem. There's been tremendous literature on how we need to do more experimentation and do effective experimentation. So when you're trying to do an experiment, it's very important to understand what is possible using the different tools. Where really are the boundaries? How good are these tools? At what boundaries? What are the limitations of all the models and the tools you're using to create your experiment? What are the underlying assumptions of these things? Because these underlying assumptions have severe impact on the end results you see. As a result, what happens is there are inbuilt biases and statistical properties within your experimentation which you will not catch if you're not careful. And so, sorry.
Can you give an example of, some of these things an example each of some of these concerns that you have in using the infrastructure properly?
Right. So, very commonly we really see people are not, I'm going to give you a simple example where people are not doing enough runs of an experiment to measure any particular property. So you really don't see error bars within anything which is being measured. Typically an experimentation process, when you're really deploying it on an emulated test bed like this, it's not simulation. So there's a lot of, these are stochastic processes. They are all, it's not going to do the same behavior again. You really need to run your experiment 50 times or 20 times at least to get some error bars. Do these, you can't just take one sample. But very, very commonly we see people taking one sample. There's also, sorry.
So I don't have a good feel for why is it that just doing one run will not help me conclude? What will change from run to run that will then help me do better experimentation?
So, as you build your model more complex, right? You're going to have background traffic there to make it more realistic. And say just the example which I gave earlier, where you want your intrusion detection systems communicating effectively, rapidly, to converge and tell you quickly that is detected an attack. Now, how that communication protocol interacts with the background traffic is going to change dynamically depending on your background traffic model. If your background traffic model is just a simple model where it's going to say just replay traffic without being congestion reactive, you will have some behavior. If your background traffic model is more realistic, where it sort of backs out when there's an attack and is congestion reactive, it's going to behave differently. And so how you design your experiment and what the underlying assumptions and constraints are when you design it, if you're not careful about it, if you don't measure it correctly at the right points, you could miss some of these things. And these things are true for all types of experiments, right? This is true for all types of networking experiments. This is not really true for this is also true for cybersecurity, not really unique for cybersecurity. I think cybersecurity is even harder, because in cybersecurity, you're actually trying to prove the negative. You're trying to prove that your system is secure in all conditions. And how do you really prove it's secure in all conditions? You try to experiment for a large range, and then you induce that it is secure because it's secure for these conditions. I'm inducing it's secure for this large range. And so you're making this induction process, and you really want to be very systematic about it, because this is a very complex system. There are a large number of players. There are complex emergent behaviors depending on how complex your models are. And what you're really doing is you're trying to push on the boundaries within experimentation, because in cybersecurity, you really care about what are the rare events and what are the worst case conditions rather than the norms here. And so what's happening, we believe, in the experimentation in the experimentation business of cybersecurity is we're actually really beginning to lose momentum, because we do not have mechanisms which will aid in this large-scale, complex experimentation, and primarily because our mechanisms to record and accumulate information from these large-scale experiments is very limited. And so what we're trying to do is really provide support for not only the experiment life cycle, but also provide support to make sure that you're designing your experiments correctly and analyzing them correctly, so that the behavior which you're really interested is captured at every stage within your life cycle. So let me sort of tell you what I mean by that is an ability to actually capture the expertise to design your experiment effectively, where you make sure that the statistical properties of your models is captured within your measurements, and you make enough measurements so that when you report your measurements, they're effectively reported. So the idea is to actually capture expertise, design tools so that you do the correct types of experimentation so that you have a better understanding as a community. And what we mean by that is define what is the expected behavior you want to really see, capture it effectively, apply during the life cycle to ensure that what you're doing is really a valid experimentation trial. So what really happens if we have an ability to capture this expertise, what we can really do is now we can share and reuse experimentation models. We not only can build on our work, but build on work of the others. And by combining our expertise, we can have really these communities of repositories of experimentation blocks. Let me tell you what I mean by this. Now, typically, what's happening right now is this is a classic testbed experimentation where you define a topology, you instantiate it somehow, it gets realized on an emulation testbed, which is a collection of nodes. They deploy the software, you create some traffic, and then you visualize it. Now, what's happening is in that process, there is no, although you have a definition and interpretation cycle, this concept of iterating is completely lost. So all you do not have a comprehensive set of tools or services which will actually capture what the interactions were at every stage and how they're related to each other. And so what we're trying to do is define mechanisms which are natural for this life cycle, which will allow you to capture it. And what we mean by that is within the definition, you have a design process, then you validate your design and an embedding mechanism to make sure that your experiment is correctly designed and embedded. Similarly, you have some for execution and for interpretation of the results. Now, today, we're primarily going to talk about these three things. So I've sort of explained what I mean by a life cycle within this experimentation. We're going to look at data analysis, experiment design, and then conclude. So within this definition, the idea is to provide an ability to capture expertise through semantic modeling, which will allow you to do your analysis effectively. And we believe once you have an ability to capture this expertise within these models, you can now devise tools which will allow you to apply this expertise very effectively to get a better understanding of what's going on in your experiment. So I'm sort of going to discuss a paper which was published in an SDI earlier this year. It's primarily about data analysis. I'm going to talk to you about it in terms of experimentation, but the results are can be generalized to any types of data analysis you really do. So what's really happening within an experiment is you have information coming from all sources within your experiment. Just like I showed you the simplified view earlier, you have a large-scale experiment, you have alerts generated from the intrusion detection system, you have packet dumps from processes and agents generating traffic on the network, you have a bunch of audit logs and application logs. And now you sit there as an experimenter and try to understand what really happened in my experiment. And typically you have questions like, did my Did my experiment really run as expected? Did a particular failure happen? So let me quickly show you what I meant here. So you have your network here, and then once you run your experiment, you have a particular workflow or a sequence of actions which occurs. And so you have, first you want to make sure that you run your cross traffic and your cross traffic stabilizes. Then your attack starts. You make sure all your intrusion detection systems are communicating. Then they install the filters, and then the attack stops at the core. So this is sort of the workflow of your experiment which you're trying to do. And earlier I showed you sort of the life cycle here is as the experiment goes on, it gets more and more complicated. And how do these timing of these events differ through each of these cycles is what you really want to capture. And once you have an ability to capture these sequence of events, you can very rapidly ask questions. Why did they occur? And if they did occur, why did a particular sequence occur? And how you can duplicate it. So the analysis process really consists of taking a bunch of data, pre-processed data, making sense of that data, and then reasoning about what happened in a very general framework. So there are essentially three parts where you have collection, storage, and normalization of this data, and then you're trying to find relationships within the data and make conclusions of why, what, and how this data is related.
So is the data coming from like the intrusion detection systems themselves, and this, the logs that they're spitting out?
Exactly. It's coming from intrusion detection themselves, the systems. They're coming from logs on the end nodes. Mm-hmm. Suppose you have, for your cross traffic, you would imagine you have a web server running somewhere. There would be logs from the target. Could be logs from the attacker locations too. These are also packet traces coming from the network. Within the network, you could deploy monitors and sensors to capture actual packet traces to understand what's going on. Okay. And all of this process, trying to make sense of what this data is telling you and trying to draw conclusions, is fundamentally usually done by the experimenter through his ad hoc processes within his head. And typically what we see is, the support we provide is simple animations telling you what types of packets are going through the network, certain graphs for visualizing what's the background traffic on the network, when the attack starts, and then you have typical Wireshark mechanisms to actually do packet filtering and understand what's going on. But all these mechanisms rely on the experimenter to know and look for patterns within the data. So if you want to ask the question, did an attack succeed? You have to look at the data and then decide visually whether an attack succeeded or not. And if not, why? You would need to dig to the data to define this. There is no mechanism to really define this expertise or capture this expertise. And if you really want to automate this process, if you really want to build the science of cybersecurity, we really need to have an ability to capture this expertise specifically and then apply it to our tools. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, is an ability to define this behavior of what it means to be an attack in a particular area. Yes, please.
So do you also ask the question, was this an actual attack or not?
Yes.
Whether this is a false positive or
right. You can formulate what question you want to ask an attack.
Oh, okay.
You can just typically as an expert, all the questions you would ask, you could formulate this so that when you do your experiment in a loop, when you're doing your experiment in a loop, you can let the system ask these questions and seek answers automatically and let you know only when the models don't match. Okay. So you can do, you can start adding some rigor to your scientific process. Okay. Then test it for the data. So what we developed is a semantic analysis framework where you can take models of the expertise, which lets you ask any types of questions, apply it to a large collection of data to tell you what's really going on. And this data this mechanism really lets you capture the expertise, apply it to a particular problem to gain some understanding. And this ability to capture this expertise is through a framework of logic, language, and models, which I'll talk about in a little bit, to really help you focus on interesting relationships. what type of an attack was it? Was it a false positive or no? Is it really an interesting relationship I'm really looking for? And then summarize it through these interesting behaviors. And it does so by taking these packet logs, applying it, and highlighting interesting matches. So it'll tell you I found 10 matches of an attack, and it'll tell you exactly what these IP addresses are. So you can really focus on it. So what it does is it takes large volumes of data, which may be multivariate, multi-type timestamp data, to reduce it to small amounts of data, which you can really focus on interesting relationships and present it in a way which is easy to understand. So what are we really doing is we are actually taking key elements within the semantic framework are an ability to take blocks of language to find combined by temporal operators to represent these interesting relationships within your data. And we let you do that through the language, which is a simple language which allows you to construct these representations which are easy and capture what the experimenter's intent is. And these models capture these behaviors through it. So what does a typical behavior model look like? It's an abstract representation of the experimenter's expertise. You take some experimentation data, you split it up into states. And how these states are related are through temporal operators. And then the behavior is a sequence of these states by causal relationships, which allow you to create a model which is a collection of these behaviors. So let me give you an example. So states are basically attribute value pairs which relate facts within the system. So the source is related to source 1, has a particular destination, and the destination has some source here. Behaviors let you take these various states and relate them by temporal operators. So in this case here we have S1 and S2 overlap. And the model takes these various blocks of behaviors and relates them through interesting relationships to create these larger blocks within the model. So let's sort of take an example here where you have find all IP flows within the data. So this is a very simple example, but interestingly enough, there's no standard format for it within Wireshark or something. You can't really query for all flows within the data very easily. So what this does is that you have a source IP and a destination IP, which it finds dynamically. And then if there is any traffic going from source A to destination B, and then traffic coming back from destination B to destination A, it'll be captured within a behavior here where source A leads to destination B to define an IP flow model. So what we're really doing is we're taking a general expertise of IP flow, applying it to identify flows within the data to make sure that you can sanity check your experiment. So you're going from these, the idea is to isolate from high-level goals within your experiment of an ability to say, did my attack succeed or not, to low-level actions within the data. So what if you had a cache poisoning attack within your experiment? So you really want to know whether this cache poisoning attack happened or not, and if it did, why did it exactly happen, and what caused it to happen. So this is the cache poisoning. In a cache poisoning attack, the goal of the attacker is to actually take over the victim NS is the target. The name server that the target is to poison it by an illegal entry. And so what really happens is there's a race condition here between the attacker and the name server. And what the attacker does is sends a query which is forwarded to the real name server, and then there's a flood of responses. So this is the type of attack which was there in the example which I showed you earlier. And what will generate is a large collection of packet logs which will come out. And here is what you really want to identify is, did the cache poisoning attack succeed? And if it did succeed, why? And when it did succeed, how quickly were the filters installed? Is what you are really trying to do when you're evaluating your intrusion detection system. Is how quickly were the filters installed once the attack succeeded. So what you would typically do is sort of create a model of what the cache poisoning attack looked like, and then very rapidly be able to tell you whether the attack succeeded and know why it did not succeed by following a path, and if it did, what was the path it followed. And so we have an ability to actually capture these models in a very simple 20 lines of code here, which takes states, behaviors, and models to relate these various fields to tell you what's going on within your experiment. So I wanted to highlight three aspects of it. First is it takes expertise and it builds on it. So the idea is if within the knowledge base we have a mechanism to capture what a DNS response request looks like and an ability to build on that. So you have an ability to import what a DNS request response looks like, and then based on that you can now actually create an initial behavior query of what it really means to poison the cache at the target. And once you have that, you can actually create high-level models, which are combinations of these behavioral models to tell you whether the attack succeeded or not. So what we're really doing here is taking this general expertise where you can define what the attack looks like, apply it to a complex large-scale experiment to really understand what's going on there. So in this case, like you mentioned earlier, your model of an attack could be whatever definition you define it to be. So I'm going to give you two other examples here. So this is what a worm spread model would look like. This would be a recursive dynamic query, which will allow you to actually find patterns of all the scan and infects within your data. So if you have an ability to actually create a spread, which is a scan followed by an infect, and then find these recursive chains within the network, it will give you a simple 4-line, 5-line model like this would give you a list of all, the list of all the infection chains within your worm spread. You could combine these with simple traffic dynamic models. Now, when an attack typically occurs, what happens is there are some traffic dynamics which change in the network. That means when an attack happens, the background traffic may back off to a much lower rate. And you want to ensure that when you design your experiment, you have that occurring to make sure that you're generating enough volume of attack traffic that your background traffic actually backs off. And this is extremely hard to verify, really, when you're running your experiment multiple times. People typically write custom scripts to do these. This dynamic change behavior can be captured, again, within very few lines of code within the experiment. And then one could imagine actually capturing these large-scale experiments with just combining models of knowledge based on these conceptual models to make basically all this analysis significantly more cognitively tractable so that people can follow it, then share and reuse the experiment models so that you can build on these. Take models of an attacker to build on and combine different works. And then the idea is, as we build rich repositories of these models, we'll be able to reuse them to do larger scale experiments.
I'm going to steal your microphone because it's cutting in and out. Okay. If you could just speak really rude, that would be fine. They're being recorded for the other people. It's just cutting out. I'm sorry. Because it's being recorded on that microphone. So
No problem.
Thank you.
So the second part, I'm actually going to talk briefly about experiment design. The idea is to actually design an experiment effectively. So again, you can capture your experiment definitions and then relate them to what you actually, through your packet captures, actually make sure that your design is effectively captures what you're really trying to do. So the idea, again, is to define semantic models for your experiment definition, apply it to tools so that you can have a better understanding of what happened within your experiment. So I'm going to start here again, which is sort of the simplified view of what my experiment looks like. And again, I have a particular workflow. And what I really want to do is systematically evaluate the intrusion detection performance under all different conditions of the intrusion detection behaviors as well as different traffic behaviors. And what we've really observed is experiments have an iterative refinement process where they quickly grow, and then there's parameterized repetitions where they're actually doing the same activity again and again to make sure that they're statistically significant. And so then so what we really need to support in order to support an experiment effectively is we need to support variations and then derivations of these experiments, which given current processes are very hard to do. So our goal is really to create a repository of reusable components within the experiment lifecycle management, which will allow people to take pieces of the experiment and build them very systematically. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So that not only can you build your experiment from pieces, but once you build your experiment, you can now very systematically parameterize each of these components to actually explore your parameter space effectively. So the idea is really through sharing and reuse of these experimentation fragments, not only can you build on your own work, but you can actually take these fragments from other people. You could take other people's models of what an attack is, other people's models of what effective background traffic is, to build these repositories. And within these repositories, take these experimentation blocks and build them together. So as you're building an experiment, you can actually put components together either within the horizontal dimension or the vertical dimension. What I mean by that really is when you're actually taking pieces of the same component type and putting them together, like in the topology, you could build them, bring them together in the horizontal dimension. And if you're actually stacking different types of components together, you can stack them on top of each other. So what we really want to have is a systematic way to grow an experiment, not only the horizontal dimension, that is an ability to grow your network systematically. So from my example, you typically wouldn't start with such a large number of subnets within your experiment. You would start with one subnet and then go from maybe 5 nodes to 20, then to 100. So the horizontal component composition gives you an ability to grow the size of your network systematically. Vertical composition lets you explore the complexity within your experiment systematically. So one could imagine starting with very simplistic experiment models where you have no background traffic initially. And then you would add background traffic and almost start with one protocol and then stack up various different types of protocol traffic on it so that you can actually build this multi-protocol complexity within your background traffic model. And we want tools to make sure that we're doing this correctly. That means whatever underlying assumptions are there in these models, they're captured throughout the stack. So the idea is to make sure that our experiment model is actually a summation of these parts, where you have a physical layer which captures what are the structural components within your experiment, along with a functional layer which has roles and relationships of how these layers are connected to each other. And the rules for putting all these layers together are based on constraints and invariants, which actually capture properties of these layers. So building an experiment would actually take different topologies, merge it together to create the final physical topology. And then based on this physical topology, you could actually have web server, web client models for your background traffic, which you would actually lay on top through vertical composition. And you would go on building your experiment through an intrusion detection system network layer, where you have intrusion detection systems and relays within it, which you would then stack on your physical topology, and then have, say, a monitoring layer which will help you deploy different monitoring points within your network and capture that data. And the idea is separating out this physical layer from this functional layer, gives you an ability to very rapidly change these layers as you need. Currently, within experimentation, all these are merged together, and that's why we call it very ad hoc and brittle. There's really no mechanism to separate them out completely and effectively. How do we go about doing this? Is we have constraint-based merging of fragments and layers. We use specialized within each type. There are either node constraints or link constraints, which allow you to merge these layers together, along with specialized constraints like boundaries and semantics. so that you can actually define these layers and stack them up together. We currently initially have an initial prototype available within the Deter lab, which is actually a catalog fragment which gives you an extensible framework to build large experiments based on these, and people are using it for a large range of cybersecurity and network experiments through it. We are looking at extending these modeling capabilities to make it more scalable and improve performance. And currently, we are actually testing this extensively within the system. So basically, I wanted to tell you was, through this mechanism, our goal is to support a wide range of user abilities. Not only will this allow us to support, if we have an ability to capture expertise, not only can we support students, we can also support astute researchers, because it will allow them to change these layers very easily. We also want to support a wide range of experimentation patterns, from hypothesis testing to deployment studies to exploration mechanisms. We are trying to build interactive user interfaces that will allow effective definition and control of these experiments through feedback and reordering of this execution and design by linking models from design and analyses and how they affect each other. We also want an ability to repeat our experiments. Once we have an ability to capture expertise, now we can actually, through repositories, share this expertise and create variations and derivations of experiments. The main idea here is to actually stand on the shoulders of others and build cumulative experiments. So once you have an ability to do something well, you want to be able to reproduce this, share it, use it as a base model, and then build upon it. So what we really want to do is that experiments should inherently support evolutions and variations in time, and they should have an ability to support diversity, that is variations over space. That means the nodes within an experiment could all have different abilities and should be able to change as an experiment grows. And sort of that is the framework where we are trying to really achieve. That's the framework we're trying to achieve through separating out expertise and specialized tools, which allow you to apply this use these tools to apply that expertise to get a better understanding of what's going on in your experiment. And with that, I can take questions.
How big is Deter at the moment?
There are
What's the physical composition of end system nodes, for example, to routers, switches?
So Deter right now has about 400 nodes.
And you said they are between USC and Berkeley?
And UC Berkeley, that's right. So there are, I think, about 150 nodes at Berkeley. Most of them are at USC. There are a bunch of routers primarily to help you configure your experiments together. You could have experiments where nodes have more than 10 links connected to each other. You could have experiments where you can virtualize your resources. So a single machine could actually be holding 20, 100 plus nodes. Yes, there's a lot of other infrastructure it's 400 plus because there are routers and switches which I'm not counting. But yes, there is a sort of a large collection of hardware resources which are available. I'll just take that and then.
Maybe it's a question, but I just want to understand, obviously the attackers are an important component of your experiments. I just want to understand where those attacks are coming. Are we talking to a system that is connected to the internet and for whatever reason some real-life malefactors want to get in? Or are we talking about a completely isolated system where you are running some kind of simulation scripts which simulate certain types of attacks like swarms or DNS?
Right. So this is sort of the complexity dimension which I was sort of talking about and the level of detail. There are mechanisms where you could actually have very simplistic models of where your attacker could just be a constant bitrate source, where you're just sending 1,000 packets per second, and you write a simple 5 lines of code which will generate this large volume of packets onto the network, right? At the other extreme, you could actually take malware, attack malware from the internet and deploy it as almost a black box where you really don't know what its behavior really is, You would, let it run in a virtual machine to generate a stream of packets or whatever it does to create an attack. We have an ability to support both ends of this horizon.
But all this is still running like a completely isolated network of your own, right? It's not part of the internet.
Yes, so the testbed is mainly contained. We do have a mechanism to talk outside with the outside world, but we sort of want to make sure that it's not completely open where we are actually getting attacked from the outside world and launching attacks from inside to the outside world, sort of thing. If you take real malware and you really don't understand its complete behavior, now deter is part of a larger botnet.
You use malware captured in the wild applications.
Sorry?
You do use malware.
You could use malware captured from the wild. In fact, there is a project where we are exploring creating a malware repository where you would actually compose your experiment by taking attack models from this malware repository.
Have you thought about using the Metasploit framework with this system as well as a way of attack generation?
Right. So the DNS cache poisoning example, which I discussed, does use the Metasploit framework to generate the Dan Kaminsky DNS attack.
Okay.
So yes, we are using the Metasploit framework. Yes.
Does the repository include the attacking schemes as well?
So we are seeding this repository based on models which we are generating. So yes, currently the DNS Kaminsky attack is an attack which we've experimented with, and we have models for what that attack would look like in its simple form and what this attack would look like if I replicate it across 100 end systems. So the graph I was showing earlier, so the visual I was showing earlier, where you had attackers in multiple subnets, here they were attackers which were actually trying to target this victim NS through this DNS cache poisoning example. So for models of an attack which we have done ourselves, yes, we have them, and that's how we're using to seed the repository. We are hoping the community gives us their models too. As this repository grows, we'll have a better sense of what we're doing.
Can you give me a little bit of a feel here for the real-world time frame if a researcher wants to come run an experiment and deter? How long should they expect the application process, the design process, all these sort of processes to take in real life?
So deter lab, the application process in terms of, so when you come to the deter lab, you typically would apply for a project, and you would tell us why you want to do, what sort of research you're trying to pursue, and usually we try to give you access to the test bed latest within a week. Now, currently, before we started this experimental lifecycle management framework, you could essentially, you can start doing your experiment the moment you get your applications approved. And you can do, the design process and the analysis process is something which you're doing yourself, and you can make it as involved as you want it to be. So you could do small scale experiments depending on how good you are or what your expertise is. You typically start with a 5-node or a 10-node experiment to try and explore what you're trying to explore, and then build it from there. Our experience is most of our users, and we have actually looked at data in the last 7 years, most of our experimenters are doing very small scale experiments. Typically they're using 2 nodes to 7 nodes. 80% of our users, very small percentage of our users are using large scale topologies and large scale experiments. And this is primarily because we do not have the support for them to do large scale experiments, because they're really very complex. Many things could go wrong, and trying to diagnose what really went wrong in your experiment is cognitively intractable very rapidly. And composing large scale experiments is very hard to do. So through the life cycle framework, we are hoping to sort of break that barrier, where we are hoping you could actually take somebody else's experiment, start from that, and then actually build on it more easily through that process. So, yeah.
I think to me the most daunting part is to know what experiment to conduct. And I don't have a good feel for, given that most of the nodes in Jupiter are located in close proximity, and they're really just one region of the planet, what would be the impact of not having this infrastructure spread across the globe? Because that's part of the thing that's happening. A lot of these attacks would use stepping stones in one part of the world, exploit one vulnerability, move on, and then have a cascading effect. And I don't have a good feel for how I would capture that through an artificial, in an artificial environment.
I mean, so sort of that is, I mean, that's sort of the crux of the problem which we're trying to solve here is take real world models and then scale them to a test bed, to an emulation or a simulation environment, right? And when you're scaling them down to a size where you're going from the internet to even a 400 node test bed, what are you losing in the process? And how do we ensure that we're not losing too much and our experimentation is still valid? There are, so sort of, the test bed is pretty powerful in the sense it'll create the topologies you want, but you need to know what you want, in a sense. Take models of what are valid internet or realistic internet topologies and then build on that. And actually that is really why we look at this ability to capture expertise as a key enabler. Because if somebody handed you a stepping stone experiment to start with, you could now actually try it out, and I'm sure as soon as you try it out, you'll get a couple of ideas of how you want to push those boundaries further, of what you could do with your ideas or your technologies to really experiment further and push the ideas further. So sort of that is the idea, is having an ability to capture expertise. Currently emulation experimentation is not repeatable because people don't have an ability to share these models. Pretty much like data analysis, we really don't capture how we analyze our data. We just analyze it. Some of us are good at it, some of us aren't good at it. And so if you're good at it, you're good at it. And, you do well and you publish a lot of results. And if you're not good at it, it's really hard to break that barrier. And data analysis is extremely tedious. It's highly repetitive. You're looking for same patterns within the data, large volumes of data. And so those apply to design too. And then so the common thread is if we have an ability to capture expertise, and we've done it pretty effectively for data analysis, we have very good results where things where we could do repetitions of an experiment and really ensure that our experiment was valid. Initially, we used to have a lot of experimentation errors which were very, very hard to catch earlier, but through this framework we can catch them very effectively. Now we're trying to do it in the design phase too.
So do you have any mechanisms in place to determine whether your model is actually a valid attack model, or whether the results you're seeing within the simulated environment, like the network topology, may be causing you to believe that this is an actual, this is an accurate model, attack model, or not?
Right.
So do you have a way to measure like any artifacts that may be imposed by the simulated environment?
Right. So our goal with this ability is actually to take models and then test them across testing methodologies, right?
Okay.
So one would actually be able to take models which you define for emulation and say try some aspects of this in deployment if they're available. So if you go from a emulated environment where you're defining your topology to a deployment environment where you're not defining your topology and it still holds, you can make some statements about how effective your modeling was, right? And then sort of that, using that systematic approach where you can actually explore the space and address concerns for each space within your experimentation and your scientific method, we are trying to very systematically explore it through this modeling process. The validity question is really sort of extremely involved in the sense what's valid. I mean, it has to be really pointed. The question has to be really pointed because everything need not, whenever you're abstracting something, you're losing some detail. And you have to be comfortable with that.
how do you arbitrate across multiple experimentals? So I may come around and I may want to use your virtualization and I may want to simulate a network of 5,000 nodes. And someone else comes around at the same time, somewhere overlaps with my experiment, and how do you make sure that there aren't undesirable effects of interaction among those two experiments?
So every experiment gets its own contained environment. So there are 400 nodes. There are a fixed number of resources. It is definitely requests are to a large extent first come first serve unless you make a reservation. There is an ability to do reservation. But once you've got your resources, you have complete access over those resources. You can assume that they're not, just through the switching technology and the routing technology, we ensure that you don't override each other's experiments. So that way it's sort of a contained environment. But yeah.
Do you know if there's been any work on creating human behavioral models? So I feel like on the deter testbed, we can definitely do a lot of good experimentation, at the network level, with generating network background traffic and so on. But I don't know, maybe when you're studying insider attack or something like that, you want to kind of have these humans sitting on top of these machines, these agents doing different types of things, and maybe that can be informed from other fields on behavioral psychology and stuff like that.
So there is actually a decent body of work there. There is the Skyon traffic generator, which generates traffic of all types. They actually now created at ISI through the artificial intelligence. This was an article covered by Economist very recently, where they've created behavioral models for how a user really interacts with the internet. What really drives him to click on a link, and what are his patterns throughout the day? How do they change during the afternoon versus night? And they've created models for human behavior to drive this traffic generation. So they are trying to create as realistic of an environment as possible, but it's still an abstraction,
Can you repeat the name of that project that created these models?
The traffic generator is called Skyon. I'm not sure if so NCR, which was the National Cyber Range, which was a DARPA-funded project about creating large-scale test beds to test cybersecurity technology. This piece came out from that. The idea was to actually drive these traffic generation models. Typically what we use is Poisson processes as arrival processes, but to drive them through human behavior. And so they actually studied what human behavior would look like and then created these abstract models to drive this traffic generation process. So there are not only host behavior models, but there are also user behavior models to drive these things.
So how do you spell the project?
Skyon, S-K-A-I-O-N.
One question, how do you said something about the experiment fragments to generate the reproducibility of the experiments. So how do you identify those experiment fragments so that it can be reproducible? Because there may be many factors involved in it, even at the system level.
Right. So every time there's an experiment realization, you have a complete experiment representation of what an experiment is. And we're using that as a basis to link these fragments together as one complete experiment representation.
But
now,
what are the experiment fragments? Means how do you identify those?
So the experiment fragments are the models which are used to drive the experiment. And they could be either base processes or they could be a collection of processes together. So a fragment, could be a single component or could be a collection of components, depending on how it's structured.
Okay, but the results of the experiment means the reproducibility of the results of the experiment may depend on some external factors as well. So do you consider those external factors?
What external factors?
In say something like say at the system level, or say a particular stack trace, or say at the system level, what is the image of a particular experiment at the system, say when you run it? So how do you...
Right. So a complete experiment model is a complete representation of the system. So it goes down to the level of what operating system you're using, what version of a web server which is running on it, everything. So you have a complete representation in one point of time of what your experiment definition is.
So it is predefined, means the information you get is
Predefined for that fragment. Yes.
It's not dynamic, means you are not
No, there are, we are sort of exploring abstract models where you could, not completely define things and things would change. But if it's a complete representation, it's all predefined, fixed, so that you have an ability to reproduce. Because one of the biggest hurdles in reproducibility is even from changing from version 2.0 to 2.3, 2.03, so many things change where it's really hard to figure out why your experiment is no longer working the way it was earlier.
If there are no more questions, let's thank the speaker again.
Thank you.